Hey everyone, welcome back. Last time we were taking a look at some of the historical events that were leading up to the Enlightenment, and we mainly focused on the developments of absolutism and showed you the ideal example of an absolutist government with Louis XIV, otherwise known as the Sun King, and how he was able to modernize France and establish France as the economic center and then turned it into the cultural center as well, and it shows you the ideal example of his cultural manifestation with the Versailles Palace, and how this was the pinnacle of Baroque art. And I want to mainly argue how Baroque art, and we're going to take a look a little bit with Rococo art as we take a look at some of the other cultural manifestations of the era, help to try to legitimize the power of the king and his rule over his subjects. But in some ways, it also helps to undermine it as people start to see that some of the opulence and the excessive pride and excess that that their leaders have. That they start to say, well, maybe we need to have a little bit of political reform, and this is where the Enlightenment is leading. Mainly what we see is some of the major values of the Enlightenment is it's really, in some ways, a political movement. It's a scientific movement. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's also a political movement. Search for new governments and to resist the old ones. And so mainly Louis XIV's way of doing business is going to be shattered as a result of the Enlightenment. We're going to see a new modern Europe emerging, which is going to be based on scientific principles of how to rule and how to govern, what's going to lead to the most amount of happiness. We also see some religious ideas starting to emerge, and we'll see a little bit of this today as I kind of briefly go through some of the founding ideas, the intellectual developments of the Enlightenment. Mainly what they believed is in what is known as deism, where that God or the organizer or the creator doesn't organize humanity's actions. They believe that he's more of a watchmaker, where he kind of creates the environment that we live in and then just sets it in motion, and then we just kind of are the ones that kind of go through the action, but he's not necessarily there interacting in day-to-day events, and that's going to be an important development. We saw a little bit of this happening with the Renaissance and the developments of free will. The Enlightenment is going to take that one step further and kind of take that to a more scientific understanding. And then there's also this belief in universals. The universals are truths or values that are common to all humanity. So there's the belief that there are things, whether that is justice or happiness or beauty, whatever the case may be, that everyone agrees with them, or they can find ideas through science, through technology. They can find ways to be able to arrive at universals. And the main universal that they're seeking for is human happiness. And so that's going to be a big part of that. One of the other things, we talked about the political concerns of the Enlightenment with feudalism and absolutism. I want to talk a little bit about the religious concerns as well, because this is another element that is important during the Enlightenment. And what we see during this time is I want to talk about two main events that happen that really stress some of the problems that the Enlightenment sees with religion. What we see is first of all, is that religion is too linked with political leaders. That religious leaders are giving their power to political leaders, and in some ways, political leaders are also trying to push and influence religious leaders. And so, in some ways, everything is geared against those the vast majority of the people, the 90% of the people who don't have a political voice. Mainly what we have is the political leaders are not in favor of them. They're mainly in favor of themselves. And the religious leaders are also not in favor with them. They're mainly in bed with the political leaders, so to speak. And so we see that there's a tremendous perversion or misapplication or misuse of power between the political and religious sectors. And so what we see is that they're going to be pushing against this. Another main element that I just want to talk about is an auto-da-fe. And what this is a religious cleansing. And some of the main ideas that they're concerned with is that abuse of power. One example of an autophagy happened in the Middle Ages around the 14th century. This is when the plague entered northern France in a town called Strasbourg. The panic and lack of understanding of the cause of the plague caused people to believe that it was God punishing humanity for humanity's sins. And so they were trying to find a way to stop the plague. They didn't really have the scientific advancements to understand how the plague actually worked. And so they just said, well, it must be God, because God's controlling all things, and we must have done something wrong, so let's rid society of its evils. And so for 6 consecutive days, 300 Jewish people were burned at the stake to cleanse Europe of its evils. And then they would take the children and then baptize them, right? So this is really one of the first modern examples of a Holocaust happening in Europe. But again, the idea is that this is supposed to be some type of religious cleansing, right? So we see some problems that religion is becoming. They're misapplying it to their contemporary concerns, and also the Huguenots. The Huguenots are Calvinists. We talked a little bit about Calvinism during the Reformation in that discussion. These mainly were people in Switzerland, but sometimes they would, spread throughout Europe. And there was pockets in England. They call them the Puritans, and there was a pocket in France, and they called them the Huguenots. And what happened is, in France, the leader, the religious leader, his name is Cardinal Mazarin. He wanted to get rid of the Calvinists to purify France of all of its, problems. And so he saw the 1.5 million Calvinists that were living in France, and he pushed them to leave in 1685. He gave them 14 days to pack up. Most of them left to Holland, but 400,000 stayed and were forced to take Mass. Right. So the idea is that you either believe what the Catholic Church tells you to believe, or we're going to make you believe it, right? And so again, I talked a little bit before about how there's some religious tensions happening with the Protestants and the Catholics, and this is one example of that, one of many examples. As they were forced to take Mass, a few of them refused or spat out the wafers, and they took these individuals and they burned them alive. The women were taken and forced into convents and forced to become nuns. But what this shows, the increasing religious tension throughout Europe. People were forced to have certain beliefs. And so the Enlightenment starts to take a look at what is human happiness? How do we create human happiness? And they're suggesting that there's some political restrictions that's limiting human happiness. There's some religious restrictions that's stopping human happiness. And so they're looking at how do we tweak these? How do we move beyond these? Taking a look at some of the literacy rates, just as a brief note, the main literate people during this time were the religious leaders who read the Bible and other sacred texts. They who would read, and we talked about this before, would interpret the information of God to anyone else. And this is where the members of Enlightenment, such as Kant, who I had you read this week, and also Thomas Paine, they detest this idea, and they detest the idea that there's an illiterate mass. And so what Kant is pushing for is that for people to be able to read so that they can then think for themselves and don't have to rely on others to think for them, because others, people in power, can tend to not have the interests of those whom they are in power over. They don't have their best interests in mind. And so this is going to start to question the idea of the dominance over education during this time. And so that's another major problem. One of the other main developments, just briefly, I want to talk about this, was the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution. Here we see during the 18th century the rise of machine power over human power. As the global markets start to expand to Europe, Asia, and the Americas, the world is starting to expand. We talked about that before with the Baroque era. It seems like the world is ever expanding. And with these increasing markets, there was an increasing demand over consumer goods such as textiles and foods. And this demand, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention, right? The necessity created a more of a demand to have, more products that were produced. And so what you see is a movement towards machine power. And so here you see on the far right-hand side a textile factory in England. So you see factories starting to develop, rather than having individuals making their own individual clothes or just making a handful for their to sell within their local communities. Now you have major factories starting to develop in order to mass produce things in order to make them more available. One of the main developments during this time, during the 18th century, was the steam engine. And the steam engine was mainly focused on producing the advancing travel, right? So James Watt was the developer of the steam engine in 1769, and this improved travel. That people, soon after, the locomotive was invented in 1803, which made shipping goods and products easier and faster, and it made transportation easier and faster. And so the result of the increased global markets and the machinery made distribution more accessible. And what this is going to do is it's going to create the rise of the merchant class. As they start selling more goods, they're going to get more money. As they get more money, they're then going to start to push for more power. And so you see really capitalism starting to change society. We're going to take a look at that in more detail, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Eli Whitney inventing the cotton gin in 1793 was another part of this industrialization, where we see him able to produce more cotton in a given day than ever was possible before. Where before, in one day, you'd do about 1 pound. With the cotton gin, with the help of the cotton gin, you could 50 pounds. And so again, this is creating more industry, it's creating more excess, more development of the economic system. And so you see, here's the locomotive. And mainly what we're starting to see is this transition. And this one is a good one. This one's by William Hogarth. He's an English painter. This one's entitled The Marriage Contract. And so what you see is this transition that's going to start happening. We'll take a look at this as one of the major developments of the Enlightenment, is the shift between political power. So what you see here, just to kind of go through this, is Lord Squanderfield. He's part of the aristocracy, part of the old money, the old power, those that had access to a political voice or somewhat of a political voice. And he's named here Squanderfield because he squandered all of his money. Mainly, he squandered it up here in the window. You can see he's building this new home for himself, this kind of massive estate, very trying to pattern it after the Versailles, right? The whole idea is to show your wealth and your grandeur. Sorry. And then over here this is a wealthy businessman. I'm not sure what his name is. He probably does have a name. But he's a wealthy businessman. He's part of that rising merchant class who's starting to have more power or more economic power. And so now they're starting to push for more political power. So here they enter into a marriage contract where Lord Squanderfield is marrying off his son, and the merchant is marrying off, marrying off his daughter in order to come together as an alliance. And so what does this guy want? What's Lord Squanderfield wants? He wants access to his money. And what's this merchant want? He wants access to his political voice. And so they're entering into this contract, this mutual contract between them. Meanwhile, the children, right, are kind of off and aloof. We see this the son here kind of looking at himself vainly in a mirror, kind of off, focusing on himself, which is a kind of a representation of the aristocracy who didn't really care about others. And then you have the daughter here who's listening to Lawyer Silvertongue, which is kind of whispering sweet nothings into her ear. So you have this loveless marriage, but the main focus is on this marriage contract. And so what you see during the Enlightenment is the rise of the merchant class, and this is starting to change society. And so the Enlightenment is the embodiment of this change, where you have the old political leaders. Their way of life is starting to fade away in the rising merchant class. People starting to question, why is it that we constantly do what we do? Taking a look at the science, the Enlightenment is also part of this scientific revolution. And it's this tension that we're going to see with religion. We've seen a little bit before during the Renaissance with Galileo, who argued that celestial bodies are not perfect and that we don't live, or that we do live in a heliocentric world. And This is pushing against some scriptures in Psalms where it says the world is established and it shall never be moved. And so the idea here is that the belief for the Catholic Church is because Psalm says this, the world cannot move. It doesn't orbit around the sun, right? And so they were angry with Galileo. They're angry with his findings because celestial bodies have to be perfect because God created them, and because the scripture says that the earth doesn't move, therefore it can't rotate around the earth. And so they were angry with him. They flogged him. They were threatening to excommunicate him until he finally recanted what he said. But there's this tension between scientific, the search for truth, and this kind of religious tradition, right? This kind of lack of understanding about, the universe around them, and just using different scriptures here and there to try to piece together their understanding. But there's this constant tension between them. And so you're going to see science and religion are going to come to a head during the Enlightenment. Francis Bacon kind of builds on this idea as we he comes from kind of this Renaissance type world, and he leads into this Baroque kind of mindset as he starts to see this ever-expanding world. He's trying to understand it. And what he mainly argues is this idea against syllogism. And a syllogism is a form of reasoning which a conclusion is drawn from two presumptions. And so an example of this is, if all birds have wings and all winged animals fly, then all birds must fly. Well, we know that's not true, right? There's birds out there, such as ostriches or emus or penguins, that don't fly, right? But the idea is that you had these false logical statements that were pushed on as people as scientific understanding. Or another one is, and we talked about this one before, if an object weighs... if object 1 weighs 4 pounds and object 2 weighs 10 pounds, then object 2 will fall at a greater velocity, right? And so, again, the idea here is we cannot trust past knowledge, right? What we need to do is we need to kind of push away from past knowledge in order to find truth. That's what's really important, right? That past logic is dangerous. And what we need to do is we need to find absolute truth. That's what we're pushing for. I mean, he was, to some extent less controversial than Galileo in that sense, but he still was fined 400,000 lira for his scientific discoveries, and he lost his job as a chancellor in England. And so you see this constant tension when you push up against ideas that people hold, these traditions that people hold, and they believe are truth. You're going to resist that. And so the Enlightenment is trying to push against tradition to actually find and understand how the world actually works. And he mainly argues that past knowledge limits our understanding. And so again, very similar to Renaissance, he's arguing that we need to liberate the mind. And so it's taking that idea of humanism and pushing it even forward. I wanted to take a look at a couple of different idols that he talks about that limit our understanding. The first one are idols of the tribe. These are ideas that humanity has, that humans assume that there's more order to life than actually exists. One example of this is, Christianity tends to believe that there's meaning in all things. If you get a flat tire on the way to work, that must mean something. He suggests maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, right? It doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means. It's just our application to that. A recent example of this, I guess it's not recent now, it's about 10 years ago, but was when an earthquake hit Haiti in 2010. Pat Robertson, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Pat Robertson. He's a very kind of strict, kind of conservative Christian TV show host. He attributed the cause of the earthquake to the Haitians making a pact with the devil and using voodoo. Not only was this bad timing and poor taste, it's against this idea of logic, right? Bacon's logic. He suggests that that science cannot be attributed to metaphysical activity, and we can't attribute metaphysical activity to the physical realm, right? We do not want doctors, for instance, who use metaphysics in their treatment. When you go in for a broken leg, you don't want them coming in and spraying some type of holy water on you. You want them to set the bone, right? And so he's suggesting that we need to avoid those things. Or another example, what happened was when a hurricane happened a couple of years ago. One politician said that this was God waking up the East Coast for voting for the wrong party. And so the idea is that scientists cannot, make that connection, right? We can't necessarily say, oh, the reason why that there's this natural event is because of some metaphysical thing. And I mean, maybe there is some metaphysical meaning or deeper meaning to it, but what they're suggesting is, as a scientist, you can't get bogged down with that. You need to actually find what's happening, how the world actually works. And so he's cautioning against prejudices that we have as human beings, and we need to be unbiased as scientists as we look towards truth. Another one is the idol of the marketplace. The idol of the marketplace is the problem of language, that words and ideas sometimes attach too much meaning to them, and sometimes they limit our way of thinking. For instance, he develops an idea about air in 1630, but there was no word for this, right, what he's coming up with. It wasn't until a century later when Joseph Priestley came up with the idea of oxygen. But there needed to be a new word to attach, this meaning to it. And so what he's suggesting is that sometimes the limitations of words limit our ability to actually advance as human beings. And so he suggests that that's another idol that we have that limits our understanding that we need to fight against. And the last one that I just want to take a look at is the idols of the theater. And these are the limitations by philosophies, that well-written philosophies are like plays. They can articulate an idea, but that doesn't make that idea true, right? So you can use an idea out there, or you can come up with an argument for it, but that doesn't make it necessarily true, right? And so this is something we need to be particularly cautious of today, as we're constantly surrounded by social media. Just because someone can write a well-written web page doesn't necessarily make it in and of itself true. And an idea, Bacon doesn't say this at the end, but this is kind of the gist of where the Enlightenment's going. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten. So what they're suggesting is that we need to do something different, significantly different. Sorry, I had to go wrestle my dog for a second there. But the idea is that they're trying to push beyond the past to actually understand ideas, right? To understand truth. Taking a look at Descartes. Descartes' another kind of step in this direction. He's coming out again of the Renaissance and leading into the Baroque era, and kind of leading us towards the Enlightenment, that they're all kind of building on one another to a certain extent. So he follows Bacon's ideas, he builds upon them. He too desires to break away from the previous approach to science, which focused on science and religion. He's suggesting that we need to kind of actually understand the world around us rather than rely just purely on religious beliefs. He says what we need proof. And so he took a mathematical approach to science, and he devised that there must be a methodical way to approach any problem. And he states, if you divide a problem into parts and examine each individually, then you can actually understand the problem. And if you understand the problem, then you can actually move closer to the truth. And so he argued against blindly accepting conclusions of the past. And so he suggests that we need to deny all truth to arrive at certainty, and then we can build upon this knowledge. And so he creates this idea of doubt, that we need to first doubt all things. And once we doubt everything, we can at least have a clear mind to then build upon to find actual truth, right? And so that's the main focus. As much like Bacon is trying to find what actually truth is, and to then base scientific understanding on that. Taking a look at John Locke. John Locke is a part of this as well, kind of leading us towards the Enlightenment, coming out of the Baroque era. And what he argues is we have no predetermined form, this idea of tabula rasa, ideas or beliefs. When we come to this earth, we are come as a blank slate. So it's not as though, God puts in us, you're going to be Republican and you're going to be a socialist, right? We just have these kind of, we are shaped by our world around us, and that is particularly important. It's important kind of understanding for them to build upon. I think we kind of take that for granted today, but it was quite revolutionary to think that we're all just kind of blank. And what that means, or what that suggests, is maybe someone's not born better than someone else. Maybe we're all born equal, and it depends upon one's environment, right? Our experience shape us, our environment influences us. And so it's important to understand that we have this certain sense of equality within this that he's going to build upon. He says the following. He says, "Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper void of all characters, without any ideas. How it comes to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store, which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. And so our experience shapes us, it determines us. And so if we can make the environment better, then we can make humanity better. And that's a big foundational element, discovery, that's going to influence the Enlightenment. He also takes a look at politics. And so he's examining how did inequality happen. As we take a look, I've showed you that chart of this inequality that we have in our society. And he argues that there's this, he kind of gives this mythical interpretation of what happened. And he said that essentially at one point, humanity was in a state of nature, that we were all free, that there was no government, there was no emphasis on bloodlines, and so we were all equal. Just being able to, this kind of like the caveman kind of mindset of we're all just kind of, we would pick up an apple, we'd eat an apple, but we didn't necessarily have property. And he argues that property, once we entered property, that this is my tree, this is no longer your tree, or this is my home, this is no longer your home. Then we have the development of labor. Now this is my tree, and anything I do to pick from it, right? This is an apple tree. I'm going to pick the apples. Therefore, those apples are mine because I was the one that worked on it. My labor is my property. Then we have the introduction in his mind of inequality. Because if you're bigger, then if you're taller than someone else, or you're more physically able to pick more apples, then you're able to have more bounty, right? And so we have this inherent inequality that happens. And so he suggests we need to be able to understand that. We need to understand the origins of inequality, because maybe the inequality that we have, there's a reason for it, that those with power and resources use their power and resources to gain more advantage over others. And this is going to be where the members of Enlightenment start questioning, hey, Louis the 14th, why do you have so much? Or, why is the government built the way it is? Why are you the one that gets to decide the way things go? Why don't more people have a voice? And they start questioning this. And so with the government, he argues that we lose our freedom. And so what he's suggesting is that we give up our freedom of living in the state of nature in order to have protection over our labor, over our property. And so people enter into government in this mythical kind of explanation of society. He says that people willingly gave up their freedom in order to have government to protect them of their property. And so he suggests that it actually is kind of necessary. It's necessary for us to sacrifice some of our freedoms. And so we think about today, we say, well, America's a free country. We hear that all the time. To some extent, that's true. We have the freedom of speech. We have the freedom of religion. We have a lot of freedoms. But we also don't have a lot of freedoms, and we sacrifice those freedoms in order to live in a country that can then protect us from foreign invaders, right? We give up, for instance, we could lose our freedom by being conscripted into the military. That's one way we lose our freedom. We lose our freedom because we have to pay taxes. So there's a lot of ways that the government takes some of our freedoms from us. And so when we hear that idea of, I want to wear a mask, you can't make me, I live in a free country, right? Well, the government, that's true to some extent, but it's also an oversimplification that the government can impose laws in order for the common good. So they're taking a look at what should be, during the Enlightenment, they're thinking about what should be the government's role, what laws should they impose, and what laws, more importantly, shouldn't they impose to allow for this idea of freedom. And they're taking a look, they're influenced by John Locke's discussion. So what he argues is people enter into this government, they want two things, right? They want a common law, something that everyone else has to follow, right? You don't want someone to not have the same rules that you have, right? And you want an indifferent judge, that someone that's not biased, to be able to rule on those common laws. And so something that's going to be important is that the laws have to be applied to everyone equally, and they also have to have someone that's able to rule on those laws. And so thinking about today, right, do we have a common law that's enforced equally, impartially? And do we have judges that's ruling impartially and equally, right? So think about maybe some of the injustices. One movement that's out there today is the Black Lives Matter movement, right? What they're arguing is that there really isn't a common law, and there really aren't impartial judges, that there's an inherent inequality. And so something to think about, just again, not to necessarily, get too political with this, but to think about how these arguments are still kind of around, and so how people are still kind of, how they're still kind of dealing with them and contending with these ideas. And question to think about is, what do you think about Locke's argument about labor and property being the beginnings of a corrupt society, right? That's where inequality comes from, is this idea of property. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that we should then get rid of property? Does that mean that we should limit property? What does that really mean? And this is what the members of the Enlightenment are thinking. These are the questions that they are asking. And here's where it says in 4th Nephi, and they had all things common among them. Therefore they were not rich and poor, bond and free, but they were all made free and partakers of the heavenly gift. And so as the Book of Mormon teaches, this idea of equality and freedom is central to human happiness. And this is exactly what members of the Enlightenment are concerned with, is how do we remove political restrictions on people so that they can have the most amount of happiness? Or how can we apply laws equally in order to have the most amount of human happiness? How can we allow equality? Or what does that mean, right? Do we enforce equality? Then we're going to have a strong government. Do we remove government and have people have more freedoms? What's going to lead to the most equal, fairest, happiest type of society? These are the questions that they're asking. Taking a look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he agrees with Locke on the origin of property and what it actually leads to, right? But he suggests that wealthy develop the right to rule to justify their wealth. And so he takes that Lockean idea of inequality and takes it one step further, and he says that the wealthy are always going to use their power to justify their wealth. That they're going to say that this wealth is mine because I worked harder than you, because I'm smarter than you, because God loves me more than you, whatever the case may be. They're trying to use their ideas in order to justify why they have more than someone else. And so he says that the real political force occurs through your ideas and how you justify the current society, right? And so what he suggests is that we need to develop a government to protect and defend property equally. He later calls this what is known as the social contract. And so as we've seen before with the Palace of Versailles, property was not equal, right? And it was not protected equally, that the king's property was more important and protected more than the property of everyone else. And so he suggests that we need to develop a government that's able to protect them equally so people have an equal voice. And again, I want you to think about this in relationship today. Do we have that type of a government today where the government actually protects property equally than others? If you get something stolen, for instance, is that the same as someone that's extremely wealthy getting something stolen? Or is there going to be a different kind of urgency happening within the law about someone's property that's coming from some wealthy kind of place, or someone that gets someone that's not as wealthy, right? The idea of, if I get my car stolen and if my car is only worth, $2,000, is it the same as if I had a, $100,000 vehicle, right? One is just theft. The other one is grand theft auto, right? So he suggests that, there are some inherent problems, some inherent inequalities that might develop in a society. Even well-intentioned, they might develop these inequalities. And so again, as we think about this application today, have we gotten there? Or more importantly, if we're not there, how can we get there, right? So he suggests that the poor are easily seduced to give up their liberty. And that's an interesting idea, that the poor will willingly give up their liberty because they don't really have a lot to give in order to get something, something very limited as a result. And he calls this the chains of bondage of the government. And so they're willing to enter into something that doesn't benefit them in order to hope that the government is actually going to benefit them, or it's going to be a benefit to them in the long run. He says we need to be very cautious of the poor and how we treat them. The solution, he says, we need to create a government that protects human freedom and equality. And then the question is, that sounds good, but then the nitty-gritty of that is, how do we do that, right? So do we have a strong government that enforces equality? Do we have a limited government so that we can have everyone have an equal chance? What does that actually mean, right? The problem, though, with that is that when you already have people who are ultra wealthy, they're going to have a leg up. They're going to have better education than the poor. They're going to have more economic resources and capital than the poor. And so it's kind of like starting a marathon, and some people are starting rather than starting at the beginning, they're starting at mile 13 and running to the end. And they're all trying to get towards the end. And the idea is that a fair race? And the answer is, well, no. So then the question is, well, what do you do to try to fix it, right? And that's where it gets a little bit more murky and problematic. He suggests that child development education that emphasizes critical thinking and avoids teaching self-interest is going to be key. And so we need to be able to have that freedom of education, that responsibility of education. Taking a look at Voltaire, just a couple other ideas here, and then I'm going to close with Kant. He opposes this idea of democracy. So not all ideas are equal. I want to show you how some people are arguing one thing, but not everyone that comes from an era is thinking exactly the same. They're not zombies. They're people that have thoughts, and they're entering into this discourse. One person has one idea, another person disagrees with it. But he suggests this about his opposition to democracy, which I think is interesting because we don't really think about opposing democracy today. We just think about it as that's the natural way. We want people to have a voice in the government. But he suggests that people are very difficult to govern in a very similar way that we see with Machiavelli. And Machiavelli's The Prince. He suggests that people are difficult to govern. So we need to recognize that, and we need to do some things that might be unethical in order to govern them. Right? He's kind of picking up on that similar kind of vein of thought. He says that they are violent, focus on wealth and pleasure, and have a strong taste for idleness, and covet other people's money, wives, daughters, and wish to be masters and subject all of their capacities. And so it's interesting. He suggests that can we really, well, as the members of the Enlightenment are pushing for democracy, to have people have a voice in the government, to have a stronger say, we see the rising merchant class wanting more political power. Voltaire says, do we really want that? Do we really want everyone to have a voice? Should everyone have a voice? And so at the time, democracy in the United States went to the wealthy landowners. They were the ones that had the voice. It wasn't everybody, right? Women didn't get the right to vote. If you didn't own property, you didn't have the right to vote. It was only people that were highly educated that had the right to vote. So the founding fathers of the United States believed this idea to a certain extent as well. And so the question that we want to think about today is, do we agree with that? Do we agree that people are difficult to govern? And mainly, the masses, if you want to call them that, are very violent, focusing on kind of self-interest, and they don't vote for the right things. They're only voting for their most immediate kind of knee-jerk reactions. And so he suggests if we're giving people, the masses, the right to vote, we're going to lead to chaos, right? I don't know how you feel about that. It's kind of an interesting thought to kind of consider as we're going through this. It's definitely something that's a difficult pill to swallow today as we're pushing against this. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we should take away the vote of everybody or the uneducated masses or however you want to think about that. But it is another voice out there. It's another side to the argument that I wanted to show you. I wanted to leave off with Immanuel Kant and his What is Enlightenment, which I had you read for this week. And what he suggests is enlightenment is the freedom from self-imposed immaturity. Very similar to Rousseau's idea of or Locke's idea of the blank slate. He's taken a look at that thought, and he suggests that since we're all born blank, what we need to do is we need to free ourselves from our own ignorance, right? So he suggests that that's what we need to do. And he suggests that self-imposed immaturity is an ignorance that lack of desire to gain understanding. And he argues this idea, sapere aude, the dare to know. And so we need to have this desire to gain more knowledge and gain more understanding so that we can become more informed and make better decisions. And so as opposed to Voltaire, who's suggesting that the masses generally don't make the right decisions, they're only kind of thinking just their immediate self-interest, he's suggesting that what we need to do, what we have the responsibility to do as the people that have a voice in the government, is we need to be able to be free thinkers for ourselves. And he suggests that there are some things that limit this, right? Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large portion of mankind gladly remains minors in all their lives, long after nature has freed them from their external guidance. They are the reasons why it is so easy for others to set themselves up as guardians. It is so comfortable to be a minor. If I have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience, a physician who prescribes my diet, and so on, then I have no need to exert myself at all, right? And so he suggests that the reason why people are ignorant is because they choose to be ignorant. They choose to allow others to think for them. And he suggests that we need to push against this, right? And so a question that I want us to think about is he correct? Do laziness and cowardice prevent us from thinking for ourselves? What kind of world do we find ourselves in today? And I saw this online. This is an NPR study, or it's actually a Stanford study that NPR reported on. But this is what it found. It says students have dismaying inability to tell fake news from real, study find. And so again, as we think about the world around us today, and I don't think it's just a student, a Gen Z kind of thing. I think this transcends generations. I think this is a problem for baby boomers. It's a problem for my generation, Gen X. It's a problem for millennials. This idea that we're so inundated with information today that we don't know what is true and what is not, and we tend to just gravitate to what we believe to be true rather than actually searching out for what truth is. And so some of those idols of the cave start to influence and shape our way of seeing, and so we need to push against that to actually start to see truth, as Bacon would say. And so what we see with Kant is that we need to push through ideas and actually verify sources in order to see truth and to have a greater understanding, to think for ourselves. He says, this is a quote from What is Enlightenment, but on all I say, on all sides I hear, don't argue, the officer says. Do not argue, drill. The taxman says, do not argue, pay. The pastor says, do not argue, believe. Only one rule in the world says, argue as much as you want about what you want, but obey. And so he says, around us, so we're constantly surrounded in society, and this is during the Enlightenment, but I wonder if it's also today, that we're always hearing, don't argue, just blindly obey, or just do something rather than actually thinking for yourself and acting for yourself. And I think about this within the church, right? Do we often just go through things because we believe that that's what we're supposed to do? We're supposed to obey. We're supposed to go through the motions. We're supposed to go to, BYU or BYU Idaho. We're supposed to go on a mission. We're supposed to get married by a certain age. I don't know, whatever the case may be. Are we really thinking for ourselves? Are we really doing for ourselves, or are we just doing because of what society is urging us to do? And he suggests that we need to be cautious of that. We need to be cautious and be able to think for ourselves, to act for ourselves. Not that I'm saying that, getting married and going on a mission are bad things. They're great things, right? But if we're doing them for others, then it might be, he suggests that it might be problematic. He says that it is difficult for any individual man to work himself out of immaturity that has all but become his nature. So another problem is that it's hard to think for ourselves because it's become so natural to us. He has even become fond of this state, and for the time being is actually incapable of using his own understanding, for no one has ever allowed him to attempt it. Rules and formulas, those mechanical aids to the rational use, or rather misuse, of his natural gifts, are the shackles of a permanent immaturity. And so we're constantly surrounded by things that are stopping us from thinking for ourselves. Whoever threw them off would still make only a certain leap over the smallest ditch, since he is unaccustomed to this kind of free movement. Consequently, only a few have succeeded by cultivating their own minds and freeing themselves from immaturity and pushing a secure course. And so he suggests that we need to critically analyze our society. And what I want you to think about is it okay to critically question? Is it okay to question? When is it okay to question? And when is it not okay to question? Something to perhaps think about. And I wanted to kind of turn to President Uchtdorf's with this kind of discussion. He says some struggle with unanswered questions about things that have been done or said in the past. We openly acknowledge that in nearly 200 years of church history, along with the uninterrupted line of inspired, honorable, and divine events, there have been some things said and done that could cause people to question. Sometimes questions arise because we simply don't have all the information and we just need a bit more patience. When the entire truth is eventually known, things that don't make sense to us before will be resolved to our satisfaction. Sometimes there is a difference of opinion as to what the facts really mean. A question that creates doubt in some can faith in others. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, my dear friends, please first doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith. We must never allow doubt to hold us prisoner and keep us from the divine love, peace, and gifts that come through faith in Lord Jesus Christ. And so thinking about that, right? What do we do with doubt? What do we do with uncertainty? How do we push past this idea of being acted upon? These are all concerns which is what we're taking a look at. And just to kind of conclude here with Immanuel Kant, he says that why don't people become enlightened? Why aren't they thinking for themselves? Because number one, they're lazy and they're afraid of knowing. They're afraid of changing. But also because it's easy, right? It's easy to have others think for you, right? And the result is we become like livestock, easily manipulated. And so something to perhaps think about whether this applies to us today is another kind of question that we can consider. Another question to kind of leave with you, and this is where we'll end, is Kant pushes for individual freedoms, and this will result in enlightenment. He looks forward to a time when the people can live in an enlightened age. Do you think that we're living in an enlightened age where the majority of public thinks for themselves? Why not? And this will be one of the discussion board questions to kind of pick up on this and to kind of get your thoughts to move past, our kind of academic study here to actually think about where the rubber meets the road, right? How do we apply these ideas to our life? How do we think about this in our contemporary worlds and whether it applies or not? That these ideas just aren't ideas just relevant in the 1700s. These ideas are relevant. They continue to be relevant. And we need to think about, are we really living in an enlightened age? And if not, how do we get there, right? It's just some food for thought.